Welcome back to the Faith to You podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rogers, and today I'm greeted by my mentor and my good friend and one of the elders here at Faith Community, Myron Hawthorne. And today, Pastor Caleb and I have been talking in the last few segments about doing all of life for the glory of God. Not just church, not just devotion time, but how do we subject every single aspect of our lives for God's glory? And so now what we're going to be doing today or talking about is we're going to be revisiting a biblical worldview. What does it look like, what it is, and specifically, how did it flesh itself out in your work and your experience? So Myron, if you want to jump in, what would you say is the essential aspects to a biblical worldview?
That's a pretty broad topic. We talked about this a little bit last Sunday. I know you were in the Sunday school class, and we were in the book of James. And I sort of alluded to this as a beginning point. And I don't know that most of us really understand what it means to have a biblical worldview, but a biblical worldview starts with an appropriate God view, that our understanding of who God is and what he does changes everything in the dynamics of how we live and what we do. And that's why I addressed it in the book of James. It's interesting to me that the very first New Testament book that was written, that James writes. One, it's interesting just because James, the brother of Jesus, it's interesting one of the apostles was not the first one to write down what became part of the canon. But James addresses a group of Christians that have been scattered by persecution, and you would think that he might want to stop and say, he's addressing them. He's saying, here's what you need to remember. Here's what you're scattered, you're under persecution, you're concerned about what's going on, and here's what you need to know. And you would think he would go to a theological base. And he doesn't. Instead, he goes to a character base. He addresses what it means to be a believer and what should be different about us if we are believers. I think people miss the point of the book of James quite often. We see that section on where's your faith without your works. And immediately we have this theological debate. Well, James doesn't believe in salvation by grace. We have a tension here in Scripture. But that's not at all what he's after. He's after an understanding that a believer, because they have met the real God, is different, and that difference should be very real and dynamic. And if there is no difference, if you have not seen a change, then something's wrong. And so we talked a little bit about this in that distinction of when you meet God. God is a very different thing. We look at world religions and world views on God, and the God of the Bible, the God of grace, is not subtly different. He's markedly different, and understanding how different is where we start to get our Christian worldview. That's a lot of words to try to get to a beginning point for your answer. But you look at the different views of God. In the pagan world, the gods were capricious. You had no idea what they were going to do.
Yep.
There was an uncertainty in life. There was, if they were in a bad mood today, it didn't matter if you'd been devout. It didn't matter if you'd been good. If you'd followed all the rules, if you'd done the right kind of sacrifices, it didn't matter.
You just need to look at the myths of like Zeus or Hera or whatever, all the stuff they did.
Yeah, you just never knew. God could just turn on you. You could be, if it had been the greatest servant he ever had or she ever had, it didn't matter. The God could turn on you today because they just had the mood to play with people. Mm-hmm. The old movie, Jason and the Argonauts, is a game between the gods, as you see them playing essentially a chess game. And that really is a depiction of the pagan view of the world. That's bad enough, but we're supposed to have the great religions. We have Buddhism, we have the Muslim faith, but here again, you can't count on God. You don't understand God completely, and your status with God is always up in the air. Mm-hmm. The list of rules, did I understand it correctly? Do I see what I'm supposed to do? Did I do the right thing? Am I in good grace or am I out of grace with God? Whether it's a cycle of working your way through the pantheon of being different types of beings and reincarnation, whatever, there's an uncertainty in life, and always an uncertainty. But we come to the God of Scripture, and unlike the deist who saw God, he created, he's powerful, but then he steps back and let's just see how things go. That kind of God, there's still an uncertainty going. God doesn't care enough to be involved. But the God of Scripture is the dynamic God of love. He's a loving Father. He's the God of grace. He's a big God, which immediately creates theological problems for us because we don't want a God that big. We're uncomfortable with it. God is in charge. He writes history, doesn't respond to history. All the other gods respond to history.
We want a God that we can either manipulate, trick, or that there's a loophole that we can work the system to either get good with God or get into heaven or whatever. We don't want a God that every single thing that happens, he is in control of. And
we want to have some aspect of that under our control. And so we want a smaller God, but of course a smaller God is not capable of dealing with life. And that too small God leads to a small and petty religion. So we have to deal with the fact that God writes history, that God controls everything. I mean, one of our greatest promises, God works all things for the good of those who believe and love him. If he's not in charge of everything, he can't deliver on that.
Nope.
The minute can imagine that God somehow can manage the details of billions of people in this world at the same time and have enough control to worry about everything that happens to Kevin Rogers and make that work out.
And not just work stuff for Kevin Rogers, but also for my sister, my brother, my mom, my dad, and he's working all that in interplaying each of those stories, each of those timelines
without upsetting
the other ones, so that he's working for every single believer, all things for their good, without messing up the good of another believer.
It's an astounding reality. But here's that God and what that worldview does. This God changes the dynamics of everything. I have an absolute assurance of my status with that God. And that changes how I view life and how I respond to life. That's why James opens with this test. It says a believer handles crisis differently than an unbeliever. Count it all joy whenever you have trials of various kinds, that word meaning multicolored. There's every possible kind of thing that can happen to you, and you count it as joy. Why? Because God is in charge of this. This is not an uncaring universe where everything is out of control. I have no idea what the next bad thing is going to be. God is in control of this. He's doing something good in all. He's giving me opportunity for ministry, opportunity for growth, because he, again, has promised this will work to my good. And now my view of things is completely different, and my motivation changes. And this is the biggest thing that is different. I'm no longer in a stature of trying to appease the God to somehow stay on his good side. I'm now in a loving relationship where now I'm trying to serve God out of a gratitude that says, this relationship matters to me, and I'm going to do things not because it checks off a list, but because that's what you do in a dynamic relationship. This is a God in charge of everything, which means his moral code actually makes sense, even if I don't always see how it does in a situation. I can always rely on that the things he has laid out and said that this is right and this is good and this is just really is right and good and just. And that living by that makes sense for that simple fact that this is a God big enough. I gave you a couple of books a while back by Francis Schaeffer, The God Who is There, and He is There and Is Not Silent. And that is the distinctive. Those are two of the most dynamic Christian books ever written for that reason, because they give us this idea of God and his size, and that God is not only there and real, but he is speaking to his creation, acting on his creation, and guiding his creation because he cares about what goes on. This changes everything in our world. We look at things differently. I think one of the biggest differences is we come to this and we look at life, and in our life, we look at our culture right now. I have so many people I know, even good friends, and I'm sorry to say some even Christian, and they're raising their children and they're making sure their kids are getting prepared for the best college, or they're getting prepared for the best career opportunity, and they're going to be trained up. We're learning 9 languages, and we're going to, they have soccer club, and they're involved in 9 different other types of activities, and they can play the cello and the violin, and they want everything perfect. But the one thing you don't have them asking is, what is the character of this child going to be? And that is the first question you ask in service to God. A God that big is, what is it I should be, rather than what is it I want to do? Mm-hmm. And that is a huge change in how we approach the world. The whole world is about us. You listen to all the graduations, the time of year for that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And all the graduation speeches are, you can achieve anything you want to do, and you can be anything you want to be, and you can. And again, it's all about the career and the opportunity. The women's movement has been, you have to self-actualize. You can't have a family. You can't do this because that's going to ruin what you want to be. And our worldview is to step back and ask, what character does God want me to have? What am I supposed to be as a person that defines everything else I will do? I'm not defining myself by the career. I'm defining myself and living that out in whatever career God leads me to. I am now looking at what it is I'm going to be as a person, how that is lived out, what values I'm going to live out. And now I approach life from that perspective. And wherever it goes, I'm not disappointed. Mm-hmm. I went to college. I got 3 different degrees. Not one of them had anything to do with what I did for a living. Now, one of them has been great just because of the Master's in Divinity and the teaching I do here. And I liked knowing Scripture.
It's very practical.
It's practical in the terms that I can be a non-paid contributor to teaching and impact with things because of the background I have. But I was an engineer for 45 years, and that was not planned. I was going to college, and I wanted to go to seminary, and I needed a job to get through college and seminary, and I started working in a shop at Cal State University Northridge, cleaning floors, scrubbing down the machines, picking up the mess after the guys that were doing the work. Mm-hmm. And a Christian gentleman that hired me said, if you want to stay after work anytime, if there's anything you want to learn, I'll stay and we'll go over it and you can learn. And I apprenticed and eventually became the manager of that shop. Without an engineering degree, I was in charge of a group of researching and designing engineers without ever going to a single engineering class. And that was not planned. But it became what I did for a living. And again, it didn't define me because, again, the definition came from my stature with God. What character would I have?